step into the grand halls of Winthrop Manor, where a radiant bride, Clara Winthrop, vanishes on her wedding day, leaving behind a crumpled gown and a cryptic note. Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead, unravels a web of secrets, jealousy, greed, and hidden truths among the manor's guests. A torn veil, a solitary footprint, and a midnight meeting lead her to a shocking revelation. Will Clara be found before it's too late? Dive into this Agatha Christie-inspired mystery, where every glance hides a clue, and trust is a fragile illusion. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest sitting room in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. The air was thick with the scent of lavender from a small bowl on the mantelpiece, and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock marked the passage of a tranquil autumn day. Miss Marple, her silver hair neatly pinned, sat in her favourite armchair, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of long habit. A half-finished shawl, soft and pale blue, draped across her lap, but her attention was fixed on a letter that lay open beside her teacup. The envelope, embossed with the crest of Winthrop Manor, had arrived that morning, its crisp paper and elegant script a stark contrast to the usual village correspondence. It was an invitation to the wedding of Miss Clara Winthrop to Mr. Edward Langley, to be held in a week's time at the grand estate in Danbury, a village some 20 miles from St. Mary Mead. The bride, Miss Marple recalled, was the orphaned niece of her old acquaintance, Lady Beatrice Winthrop, a woman of impeccable breeding but a guarded disposition. The groom, however, was a name unfamiliar to her, which was itself a point of interest. In Miss Marple's experience, newcomers to such circles often brought complications. She adjusted her spectacles and reread the invitation, her keen eyes noting the flourish of Beatrice's signature. "How very curious," she murmured, her voice soft but laced with the quiet authority of one accustomed to unraveling life's small mysteries. "Beatrice and I have not exchanged so much as a Christmas card in a decade. Why now, and why such haste? A wedding in 7 days suggests urgency." Miss Marple set her knitting aside and leaned back, her fingers steepled thoughtfully. She remembered Beatrice from their younger days, when they had met at a charity bazaar in London. Beatrice, then newly married to Sir Henry Winthrop, had been a striking figure, her poise masking a certain wariness, as if she were always guarding a secret. The Winthrop family was old and wealthy, their estate a labyrinth of history and rumour. Clara, their ward, had been a child then, a quiet girl with wide eyes, orphaned after a carriage accident claimed her parents. Miss Marple had heard whispers of Clara's beauty and charm in recent years, but little else. As for Edward Langley, the invitation offered no clues beyond his name and the promise of a joyous union. The village of St. Mary Mead had taught Miss Marple that joy, when proclaimed too loudly, often concealed unease. She thought of Mrs. Clement's niece, who had married in haste and lived to regret it, and of the young curate whose engagement had ended in whispers of scandal. People are so very predictable, she mused, and yet so very surprising. Her mind turned to the possibility of hidden motives, debts, rivalries, or perhaps a secret known only to the bride. The invitation, she decided, was not merely a courtesy, but a summons, whether Beatrice intended it as such or not. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple moved to the window, her gaze resting on the tidy gardens of St. Mary Mead. The roses were fading now, their petals curling in the October chill, but the sight steadied her thoughts. She would accept the invitation, not out of sentiment, but because her instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, told her there was more to this wedding than met the eye. A visit to Winthrop Manor would allow her to see for herself the currents beneath the surface, the glances and silences that spoke louder than words. She penned a brief, gracious reply, promising her attendance, and rang for her maid, Dolly, to post it. "I shall need my black lace shawl and the grey silk dress," she instructed, her tone brisk. "And perhaps the pearl brooch. One must be prepared for all eventualities." As Dolly bustled off, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind already sketching the outlines of Winthrop Manor and its inhabitants. She pictured Clara, a vision in white, and Edward, a man whose charm might hide ambition or worse. Beatrice, too, would bear watching, for a woman of her stature did not act without purpose. And there would be others, servants, guests, perhaps a jealous suitor or a resentful relative, each with their own story, their own secrets. The train to Danbury, she decided, would be the first step into a puzzle she was determined to solve. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft twilight, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, a quiet counterpoint to the questions forming in her mind. A wedding was a beginning, but it could also be an ending, and she intended to discover which it would be. Chapter 2. The Manor's Shadow. The train from St. Mary Mead to Danbury wound through the autumn countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing backdrop to Miss Jane Marple's thoughts. She sat by the window, her hands folded neatly over her small travelling case, her eyes tracing the patchwork of fields and hedgerows, bathed in the amber light of late afternoon. The invitation to Clara Winthrop's wedding lay tucked in her handbag, its elegant script still stirring a faint unease. As the train slowed at Danbury station, she gathered her shawl and stepped onto the platform, where a liveried driver from Winthrop Manor awaited her. The drive to the estate was brief but revealing. The road curved through dense woods, their leaves a riot of crimson and gold, before opening onto the sweeping grounds of Winthrop Manor. The house itself was a vision of Georgian splendour, its grey stone facade softened by ivy that clung to the towers like a possessive lover. Yet, as the car crunched along the gravel drive, Miss Marple noted the subtle signs of neglect. A cracked urn by the entrance, weeds creeping into the rose beds, and a certain heaviness in the air, as if the manor held its breath. Lady Beatrice Winthrop greeted her at the grand oak doors, her smile as polished as the silver candelabra in the hall. She was a tall woman nearing 60, with silver-streaked hair swept into an elegant chignon, and eyes that betrayed a flicker of strain beneath their warmth. "Jane, my dear, how kind of you to come," she said, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "It has been too long." "Far too long," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her gaze sharp. She noted Beatrice's impeccable silk dress, the sapphire brooch at her throat, and the slight tremor in her fingers. "You have a lovely home, Beatrice. It must be a joy to host such a happy occasion." Beatrice's smile tightened. "Clara is radiant, and Edward is most suitable. Come, let me show you to your room." The hall was a marvel of polished marble and ancestral portraits, their stern faces watching as Miss Marple followed Beatrice up a curving staircase. The manor buzzed with activity. Maids darted with armfuls of linens, a footman balanced a tray of crystal glasses, and the scent of fresh roses wafted from the ballroom. Yet, beneath the bustle, Miss Marple sensed a tension, like a string pulled taut before a note is struck. Her room was a charming chamber overlooking the gardens, its walls papered in faded chintz, and its hearth aglow with a small fire. Beatrice lingered, gesturing to the view. "Clara loves the gardens," she said. "She's been planning the wedding breakfast there under the arbour." "How delightful," Miss Marple said, setting her case on the bed. "Clara must be thrilled. And her young man, Mr. Langley, is it? He is from these parts." Beatrice hesitated, a shadow crossing her face. "Edward is new to Danbury. His family is from the north, I believe. A fine man, though, very devoted." Her voice carried a practiced assurance, but Miss Marple caught the faintest note of doubt. After Beatrice departed, Miss Marple unpacked her modest belongings, her mind already cataloguing impressions. Beatrice's hesitation, the grandeur of the manor juxtaposed with its subtle decay, and the rushed wedding all pointed to something amiss. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a hurried engagement had masked a financial scandal. People do not change, she thought, pinning her pearl brooch to her dress. They only hide their motives better. Dinner was served in the dining room, a vast space lit by chandeliers that cast a golden glow over the mahogany table. Miss Marple, seated between Beatrice and a quiet clergyman from Danbury, observed the assembled company with her usual unobtrusive care. Clara Winthrop, the bride-to-be, was a vision of youthful beauty, her auburn hair cascading in soft curls and her green eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and nerves. She wore a cream silk gown that shimmered in the candlelight, but her laughter, Miss Marple noted, was a touch too bright, her glances toward Edward Langley a shade too anxious. Edward himself was a handsome man in his early 30s, with dark hair and a disarming smile. His manners were impeccable, his conversation charming, yet there was a guarded quality to his eyes, as if he were playing a part. He spoke of London, of vague business ventures, but offered little of his past. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, thought of the young doctor in St. Mary Mead, who had charmed the village only to be revealed as a fraud. Charm, she knew, could be a dangerous mask. Across the table sat George Winthrop, Beatrice's son, a man of about 28, with a sullen air and a glass of claret rarely far from his hand. His broad shoulders and fair hair suggested a once athletic frame, but his bloodshot eyes and slouched posture spoke of dissipation. He barely spoke, his gaze fixed on Clara with an intensity that bordered on resentment. Miss Marple wondered at his mood. Was it jealousy, debt, or something deeper? Miss Lydia Crane, introduced as Clara's childhood friend, was a sharp contrast to the bride. Her dark hair was pulled severely back, and her grey eyes darted restlessly, lingering on Edward with a mix of disdain and something Miss Marple could not quite place. Envy, perhaps, or betrayal. Lydia's conversation was brittle, her laughter forced, and when Clara spoke of the wedding, Lydia's lips pressed into a thin line. The final guest of note was Mr. Harold Vance, the family solicitor, a wiry man with thinning hair and a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. He spoke little, his attention divided between his plate and furtive glances at Beatrice, as if seeking her approval. Miss Marple, attuned to such details, sensed his unease. Solicitors, in her experience, often knew more than they let on, especially where money was concerned. The meal progressed with the usual pleasantries, but Miss Marple's ears caught the undercurrents. Clara spoke of the wedding with a feverish enthusiasm, describing the flowers, the music, the gown, yet her hands twisted her napkin as she spoke. "It will be perfect," she said, her voice almost a plea. "Edward has planned everything so beautifully." Edward smiled, laying a hand on hers. "Only the best for you, my dear." His tone was warm, but Miss Marple noted the brief tightening of his jaw, as if the words cost him effort. Beatrice steered the conversation to safer topics, the weather, the history of the manor, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She thought of the village postmistress, Mrs. Baker, whose nervous chatter had once betrayed a secret affair. Clara's brightness, she suspected, hid a similar fear. Was it the wedding itself, the groom, or something else entirely? After dinner, the party adjourned to the drawing room, where a fire crackled and a pianoforte stood in one corner. Clara, at Beatrice's urging, played a soft melody, her fingers deft but her expression distant. Edward stood by her side, turning the pages, while George slouched in an armchair, his glass refilled. Lydia hovered near the window, her silhouette stark against the velvet curtains, and Mr. Vance excused himself to review some papers. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting, watched them all, her needles clicking like a metronome to her thoughts. As the evening wore on, she engaged Lydia in conversation, her questions gentle but probing. "You and Clara must have such memories," she said, her smile disarming. "It's rare to see such a friendship endure." Lydia's eyes flickered. "We were close as children," she said, her voice clipped. "But people change, don't they? Clara has her future now, and I have my own path." Miss Marple nodded, noting the bitterness in Lydia's tone. She thought of the vicar's daughter in St. Mary Mead, whose envy of a friend's engagement had led to spiteful gossip. Envy, she knew, could fester into something darker. Later, as the guests dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her sharp eyes catching a fleeting exchange. George, passing Lydia near the staircase, muttered something low and urgent. Lydia's reply was sharp, her hand gesturing dismissively before she hurried away. Miss Marple, unseen in the shadows, filed this away. Words spoken in haste, she knew, often held the key to deeper truths. In her room, she sat by the window, gazing at the darkened gardens. The arbour, where Clara planned her wedding breakfast, was a faint outline in the moonlight, its roses ghostly against the night. Miss Marple's mind turned to the players in this drama. Clara, radiant but fearful. Edward, charming but opaque. George, brooding and reckless. Lydia, resentful and secretive. And Beatrice, whose hospitality masked a quiet dread. Mr. Vance, too, was a piece of the puzzle, his nervousness suggesting knowledge he dared not share. She thought of a wedding in St. Mary Mead, where a bride's hesitation had revealed a blackmailer's plot. "There is always a reason," she murmured, drawing her shawl closer. "And reasons, once found, lead to answers." As she prepared for bed, the manor settled into silence, broken only by the distant creak of a floorboard. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, told her that Winthrop Manor held secrets, and the wedding, so eagerly anticipated, might yet unravel them. She closed her eyes, her mind already tracing the threads of a mystery that was only beginning to take shape. Chapter 3. The Disappearance. The first light of dawn crept through the heavy curtains of Miss Jane Marple's room at Winthrop Manor, painting the chintz walls with a pale glow. She had slept lightly, her mind stirred by the undercurrents of the previous evening. The strained smiles, the guarded glances, the whispered exchange between George and Lydia. Rising early, as was her habit, she dressed in her sensible grey frock and pinned her pearl brooch with care, her movements precise, but her thoughts far from the quiet routine. The manor, she sensed, was poised on the edge of something momentous. As she descended the grand staircase, the house seemed hushed, its usual bustle subdued. The scent of fresh coffee and toast drifted from the dining room, but before Miss Marple could reach it, a piercing cry echoed from the upper floor. It was a sound of raw distress, sharp and unmistakable, and it sent a shiver through her. She paused, her hand on the banister, as footsteps pounded above and voices rose in a jumbled chorus. Lady Beatrice appeared at the top of the stairs, her face ashen, her silk robe clutched tightly about her. "Jane!" she called, her voice trembling. "It's Clara. She's gone." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained calm. "Gone, Beatrice? What do you mean?" she asked, ascending the stairs with surprising agility for a woman of her years. Beatrice led her to Clara's room, where a small crowd had gathered. Edward Langley, his face pale but composed. George Winthrop, dishevelled and red-eyed, as if he had not slept. Lydia Crane, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or guilt. and Mr. Harold Vance, the solicitor, hovering at the edge of the group, his spectacles glinting nervously. Servants milled about, their whispers adding to the air of confusion. The room itself was a study in disarray. Clara's wedding dress, a confection of white silk and lace, lay crumpled across the bed, as if discarded in haste. Her veil hung limply on a chair, and her satin shoes were missing. The window stood ajar, its latch undone, admitting a chill breeze that stirred the curtains. A silver tray with a half-drunk cup of cocoa sat on the bedside table, and a single pearl earring lay on the floor, glinting in the morning light. "She was here last night," Beatrice said, her voice breaking. "I saw her myself, after she played the pianoforte. She said she was tired and would retire early. And now," her hands gestured helplessly at the empty room. Edward stepped forward, his jaw tight. "She wouldn't leave like this," he said firmly. Clara was happy, excited for today. Something must have happened. George snorted, his voice thick with disdain. "Run off, more like. Cold feet, perhaps. She's always been flighty." His words were cruel, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes avoided. "The open window." Lydia's voice was sharp. "Don't be absurd, George. Clara wouldn't just vanish. She loves you, Edward." Her words were meant to comfort, but they carried an edge, and Miss Marple caught the fleeting glance she cast at Edward, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mr. Vance cleared his throat, his fingers fidgeting with his cufflinks. "We should search the grounds at once," he said, his voice thin. "She may have wandered off. The gardens are extensive." Beatrice nodded, issuing orders to the servants, who scattered to begin the search. The police were summoned, and a young constable arrived, his notebook at the ready, but Miss Marple knew that official inquiries often miss the subtleties of human nature. She remained in the room, her eyes scanning every detail, her mind already sifting through possibilities. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a theft by noticing a single displaced cushion. Here, the clues were more troubling. The open window, the missing shoes, the abandoned dress. She approached the window, her sensible shoes silent on the thick carpet. The sill was clean, with no signs of forced entry, but a faint smudge of dirt caught her eye, as if someone had brushed against it. Outside, the gardens stretched toward the arbour, their paths shrouded in morning mist. "A bride does not leave her dress behind without reason," she murmured to herself. "Nor does she open a window in October unless compelled." Turning back to the room, she addressed Beatrice, who stood wringing her hands. "Did Clara seem herself last night? Any sign of distress?" Beatrice hesitated, her eyes darting to Edward. "She was nervous, perhaps. It's natural for a bride, isn't it? She spoke of the wedding, how much it meant to her, but she did seem preoccupied." Edward's face darkened. "She was fine," he insisted. "We talked before she retired. She was happy, said she couldn't wait to be my wife." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers clenched, the slight sheen of perspiration on his brow. Lydia, standing near the door, spoke softly. "She was restless last night. I saw her pacing in the hall, but she wouldn't speak to me." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple wondered if it was grief or something else. The constable, an earnest young man named Perkins, began questioning the household, but his inquiries were broad, lacking the precision Miss Marple knew was needed. She slipped away, her presence unnoticed amid the chaos, and made her way to the servants' quarters. There she found Elsie, the young maid who had attended Clara. Elsie was pale, her apron twisted in her hands, and Miss Marple's gentle smile put her at ease. "Elsie, dear," Miss Marple began, her tone as soothing as a cup of tea. "You saw Miss Clara last night, didn't you? Did anything strike you as unusual?" Elsie hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "She was anxious, miss. Kept looking at the clock, like she was waiting for something. She asked me to leave her alone after I brought her cocoa. Said she needed to think." Did she mention anything specific? A visitor, perhaps? Or a letter? Miss Marple's voice was light, but her eyes were keen. Elsie's cheeks flushed. There was a letter, miss. I saw it on her desk when I brought the tray. She snatched it up quick like she didn't want me to see. It wasn't in her usual stationery. Looked rougher, like it came from someone else. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A letter, she thought, could be the key. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a single note had exposed a blackmail scheme. "Thank you, Elsie," she said, patting the girl's arm. "You've been most helpful." Returning to the hall, Miss Marple found the search party regrouping. The gardens had yielded no sign of Clara, nor had the stables or the outbuildings. The constable spoke of expanding the search to the village, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The letter, the open window, the missing shoes, all pointed to a deliberate act, not a whim. Clara had been lured or taken, she was certain, and the answer lay within the manor's walls. She approached Beatrice, who stood by the fireplace, her face drawn. "Beatrice, dear," Miss Marple said softly, "might I see Clara's room again? There may be something we've overlooked." Beatrice nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Of course, Jane. Anything to find her." In the room, Miss Marple examined the desk, finding no trace of the letter Elsie had described. The diary, however, caught her eye, a small, leather-bound volume with a lock. She glanced at Beatrice, who was distracted by the constable's questions, and quietly tested the lock. It was secure, but a quick search of the jewellery box revealed a tiny key. Miss Marple slipped the diary into her handbag, resolving to examine it later in private. For now, she needed to observe the household, to watch for the tells that betrayed guilt or fear. As the morning wore on, the manor became a hive of activity, with servants searching and guests whispering. Edward remained composed, organising the men to check the woods, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of desperation. George, sullen and withdrawn, retreated to the library with a decanter of brandy. Lydia hovered near Beatrice, her face a mask of concern, but her hands twisted nervously. Mr. Vance, meanwhile, paced the hall, muttering about legal matters and the wedding's postponement. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, where she took up her knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically as she watched the others. She thought of the village seamstress, whose disappearance had been no disappearance at all, but a carefully staged deception. People, she mused, are so very careless with their secrets. They leave them in plain sight if one knows where to look. The open window, the letter, the missing, shoes. These were the threads of a pattern, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them together. As the clock struck noon, she settled into her chair, her eyes bright with purpose. Clara Winthrop had not vanished of her own accord, and the truth, she knew, was waiting to be found. Chapter 4. The Clue in the Garden. The morning air at Winthrop Manor carried a crisp bite, and the mist that clung to the gardens lent an ethereal quality to the scene, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her black lace shawl, slipped out of the manor while the household was preoccupied with the search for Clara Winthrop. The constable's men were combing the woods beyond the estate, and the guests, fractious and uneasy, had retreated to their own corners of the sprawling house. Miss Marple, however, preferred to begin where the clues were freshest, and her instincts drew her to the gardens, where the open window in Clara's room suggested a path. The gravel paths crunched softly under her sensible shoes as she made her way toward the rose arbour, a charming structure draped in late-blooming climbers, their petals a vivid scarlet against the grey morning. She moved with the unhurried grace of one accustomed to observing without being observed, her eyes scanning the ground for anything out of place. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a case of stolen silver by noticing a single bent blade of grass. Here, she sought something equally telling. Near the arbour, where the path curved beneath an arch of thorny branches, she paused. Caught on a low-hanging rose stem was a scrap of delicate white lace, its edges frayed as if torn in haste. Miss Marple bent closer, her fingers deftly freeing the fragment without disturbing the thorns. It was fine work, the kind used in a bridal veil, and she recalled the veil draped over Clara's chair, its hem intact, but its presence in the room a stark contrast to this torn piece. "Now, this is curious," she murmured, tucking the lace into her handkerchief. "A bride does not tear her veil unless she is fleeing or being pursued." She straightened, her gaze sweeping the surrounding earth. The soil near the arbour was soft, spared the hardening frost by the shelter of the roses, and there, in a patch of disturbed ground, was a single footprint. It was small, unmistakably a woman's, and the heel bore a slight indentation, as if from a low shoe rather than a boot. Miss Marple knelt, careful not to disturb the mark, and noted its direction, away from the manor, toward the dense shrubbery beyond. Not running, she thought, but hurrying, and alone perhaps, or so she thought. The discovery sharpened her focus. She followed the path a few steps further, but the ground grew firmer, and no other prints appeared. The shrubbery, thick with laurel and holly, offered no clear passage, and the mist obscured any distant traces. Yet the lace and the footprint were enough to confirm her suspicion. Clara had left her room through the window, not on a whim, but with purpose, and something, or someone, had caused her to tear her veil in haste. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sought out Elsie, the maid, who was polishing silver in the pantry, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. The girl's eyes widened at Miss Marple's approach, but the older woman's gentle smile eased her nerves. "Elsie, dear," Miss Marple began, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "You mentioned a letter last night. Can you recall anything more about it? The colour of the paper, perhaps, or the way Miss Clara held it?" Elsie hesitated, her cloth pausing over a candlestick. "It was plain paper, miss, not like the fancy kind she uses. A bit yellowed, like it came from an old book." She held it close, like she was afraid I'd read it. "I only saw it for a moment before she hid it in her diary." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the locked diary she had slipped into her handbag. "And did she say anything else? Perhaps about meeting someone?" Elsie shook her head. "Not directly, miss, but she was pacing, muttering to herself. I heard her say something about knowing the truth. She sounded scared, but determined, like." "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand. "You've a good memory, and that's a great help." As she left the pantry, her thoughts were racing. A letter on plain paper, a torn veil, a footprint leading to the shrubbery. These were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was adept at fitting such pieces together. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's disappearance had been traced to a clandestine meeting, prompted by a note that promised answers, but delivered danger. Back in her room, Miss Marple retrieved the diary from her handbag and used the small key from Clara's jewellery box to unlock it. The pages were filled with Clara's neat, looping script, detailing her excitement for the wedding, her love for Edward, and her dreams of a new life. But the tone shifted in the final entries, dated the day before her disappearance. October 23rd. I received a letter today, slipped under my door. It bids me meet someone by the arbour at midnight to learn something vital to my future. I am afraid, but I must know. Edward must not suspect. He would worry so. I will go alone. The letter itself was tucked between the pages, its creased surface confirming Elsie's description. Plain, slightly yellowed paper, with no crest or watermark. The handwriting was angular, almost hurried, and read, "Meet me at midnight by the arbour. Tell no one. Your future depends on it." It was unsigned, but its tone was commanding, almost menacing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A summons, she thought. But to what end? Blackmail, a warning, or something worse? She closed the diary, her mind sifting through possibilities. The letter suggested Clara had been lured to the arbour, but the torn lace and footprint implied she had not gone willingly, or had not gone far. The absence of struggle in her room, save for the crumpled dress and open window, pointed to a sudden decision, perhaps prompted by fear or urgency. Miss Marple considered the household. Edward, whose devotion seemed genuine, but whose past was shadowy. George, whose sullenness and debts hinted at desperation. Lydia, whose sharp glances at Clara betrayed envy. And Mr. Vance, whose nervous demeanour suggested he knew more than he admitted. She resolved to observe the guests further, but first she returned to the drawing room, where Beatrice was attempting to maintain order amid the growing panic. The constable, Perkins, had returned from the woods with no news, and the household was fraying at the edges. Edward paced by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, while George slouched in a chair, a glass of brandy in hand. Lydia stood by the window, her face pale, and Mr. Vance hovered near Beatrice, murmuring about legalities. Miss Marple took her usual seat, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. She addressed Beatrice quietly, so as not to draw attention. "Beatrice, dear, has Clara ever spoken of receiving strange letters before? Perhaps from someone outside the family?" Beatrice's eyes widened, but she shook her head. "Not that I know of, Jane. She's been so absorbed with the wedding. But she did seem distracted yesterday. I thought it was just nerves." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts elsewhere. The letter's plain paper suggested it came from someone within the manor, someone who lacked access to fine stationery but knew Clara's habits. A servant, perhaps, or one of the guests disguising their hand. She thought of George, whose reckless behaviour might drive him to desperate measures, or Lydia, whose resentment could have festered into malice. Edward, too, remained an enigma, his charm too polished, his origins too vague. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple slipped back to the garden, this time accompanied by Elsie, whom she trusted to keep silent. She showed the maid the footprint, asking if it matched Clara's shoes. Elsie, after a moment's study, nodded. "Those are her walking shoes, miss. She wore them for strolls in the garden. But why would she go out at night, in her nightgown?" "A good question," Miss Marple said, her eyes bright. "Perhaps she didn't intend to go far." She glanced at the arbour, its roses now vivid in the rising sun. The torn lace, the footprint, the letter, all pointed to a meeting gone wrong. Clara had gone to the arbour, but what had she found? And where was she now? Returning to the manor, Miss Marple resolved to keep the diary and letter secret for now, until she could gauge the reactions of the household. She thought of the village baker in St. Mary Mead, whose disappearance had been solved by a single overheard conversation. Here, the truth lay in the silences, the glances, the things left unsaid. As she rejoined the others, her knitting needles clicked softly, a quiet counterpoint to the storm brewing within Winthrop Manor. Chapter 5. The Hidden Note. The late morning light filtered through the tall windows of Winthrop Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floors, as the household grappled with Clara Winthrop's disappearance. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, her eyes keen beneath her mild expression. The discovery of the torn lace and the footprint in the garden had sharpened her focus, and the locked diary, now safely tucked in her handbag, held secrets she was determined to unravel. The letter Elsie had described, with its cryptic summons to the arbour, suggested a deliberate act, and Miss Marple's instincts told her the truth lay close, hidden in the tensions of the manor's inhabitants. The atmosphere in the house was strained, like a violin string wound too tight. Lady Beatrice, pale and drawn, issued orders to the servants with a forced calm, while Edward Langley paced the hall, his polished demeanour fraying at the edges. George Winthrop, sullen and unsteady, had retreated to the library, his brandy glass a constant companion. Lydia Crane hovered near Beatrice, her face a mask of concern, but her restless hands betrayed an inner turmoil. Mr. Harold Vance, the solicitor, darted between rooms, his nervous energy palpable as he muttered about estate matters. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, watched them all, her mind sifting through the clues. The open window, the torn veil, the footprint, and now the mysterious letter. Determined to examine the diary in private, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need to rest, and retired to her room. The chamber, with its faded chintz and crackling fire, offered a quiet refuge. She locked the door, a precaution born of years observing human nature's darker impulses, and retrieved the diary from her handbag. The small key, found in Clara's jewellery box, turned smoothly in the lock, and the pages opened to reveal Clara's neat, looping script. The entries began with the joy of a bride-to-be, descriptions of her gown, plans for the wedding breakfast, and tender words about Edward's devotion. But as Miss Marple turned to the final pages, the tone shifted, becoming hesitant, almost fearful. The entry from 2 days prior caught her eye. October 22nd. I cannot shake this unease. Edward is everything I dreamed, but there are whispers, questions about his past. Lydia says I am foolish to trust so quickly, but she has always been cautious. Yesterday I found a note slipped under my door. It spoke of secrets, of things I must know before I wed. I burned it, but its words linger. Am I being watched? The final entry, dated the day before her disappearance, was briefer, its words heavy with resolve. October 23rd. Another note came, rougher than the last, bidding me meet at the arbour, at midnight. It promises the truth about my future. I am afraid, but I must go. Edward must not know. He would stop me. If I am to be his wife, I must face this alone. Tucked between the pages was the letter itself, its plain yellowed paper creased from being folded tightly. The handwriting was angular, almost aggressive, and the message was as Elsie had described. Meet me at midnight by the arbour. Tell no one. Your future depends on it. Miss Marple held the paper to the light, noting the faint watermark of a common stationer, the kind found in any village shop. Not the work of a gentleman, she mused, or someone wishing to appear as one. The absence of a signature suggested secrecy, perhaps fear, and the choice of paper hinted at someone within the manor's orbit, someone who could not afford finer stationery or did not wish to be traced. She closed the diary, her mind racing. The letter confirmed her suspicion that Clara had been lured to the arbour, but the torn lace and footprint suggested she had not gone far, or had not gone willingly. The diary's mention of an earlier note, burned and unrecoverable, hinted at a pattern, a campaign to unsettle Clara. Miss Marple thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a series of anonymous letters had driven a young woman to despair, revealing a jealous rival. Here the motive was less clear, money, love, or revenge, but the players were coming into focus. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her presence as unobtrusive as ever. The household had gathered for a strained luncheon, the table set with cold meats and fruit, but the air was thick with unspoken questions. Edward sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Beatrice attempted to keep conversation alive with talk of the weather. George, red-eyed and dishevelled, pushed his food around, his silence heavy. Lydia's gaze darted between Edward and Beatrice, her fingers twisting a napkin into knots. Mr. Vance, seated at the far end, ate sparingly, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he glanced nervously at the others. Miss Marple, ever the observer, chose her moment. "Beatrice, dear," she said, her voice gentle, "has Clara ever mentioned receiving odd letters before? Perhaps something that troubled her?" Beatrice's fork paused mid-air, her eyes flickering with surprise. "Letters? No, She never spoke of such things. Why do you ask? Oh, just a thought, Miss Marple said lightly, her needles clicking. Young women sometimes receive notes, silly things, or perhaps warnings. It's not uncommon before a wedding. Edward's head snapped up, his voice sharp. Warnings? What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? Clara was happy. She had no reason to be troubled. Miss Marple met his gaze with a mild smile. Of course, Mr. Langley. I only wondered if she might have confided in someone. Brides can be sensitive, you know. Her tone was disarming, but her eyes noted the flush in Edward's cheeks, the way his hand tightened on his glass. Lydia spoke up, her voice brittle. Clara was nervous, that's all. She told me the wedding was overwhelming her. Nothing about letters. Her words were quick, almost defensive, and Miss Marple caught the glance she cast at George, who avoided her eyes. Mr. Vance cleared his throat, his voice thin. If there were letters, they might be irrelevant. Clara's disappearance could be a misunderstanding. She might have needed air, gone for a walk. His suggestion sounded hollow, and Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his brow. The conversation faltered, and Miss Marple let it drop, her mind already turning to the next step. The letter's handwriting was unfamiliar, but it bore a faint resemblance to the scrawl on a note she had seen in the library, a list of estate expenses in Mr. Vance's hand. Yet the solicitor's nervousness seemed more fearful than guilty. George, with his debts and sullen demeanour, was a more likely candidate, or perhaps Lydia, whose envy of Clara was barely concealed. Edward, too, remained a puzzle. His devotion to Clara seemed genuine, but his guarded air suggested secrets. After luncheon, Miss Marple slipped into the library, where George sat alone, a decanter at his elbow. She approached with her usual tact, her voice soft. Mr. Winthrop, you must be terribly worried about your cousin. Have you any idea where she might have gone? George looked up, his eyes bloodshot. Clara, she's probably off sulking somewhere. Always was dramatic. His tone was dismissive, but his hand shook as he poured another drink. Miss Marple tilted her head. Dramatic? She seemed so happy last night. Did she confide in you at all? Perhaps about a worry or a letter? George's glass paused at his lips, his eyes narrowing. A letter? What are you getting at, old lady? His rudeness was telling, and Miss Marple's smile remained serene. Nothing at all, dear, she said, responsively. Just an old woman's curiosity. You young people are often impulsive, you know. She turned away, leaving him to his brandy, but her mind was busy. George's defensiveness was a clue, though whether of guilt or mere irritation, she could not yet tell. As she left the library, she overheard a snatch of conversation in the hall. Lydia and Edward, their voices low and urgent. You should have told her, Lydia hissed. She deserved to know. Edward's reply was inaudible, but his tone was sharp, and Lydia stormed off, her face flushed. Miss Marple, hidden by a corner, filed this away. Secrets, she knew, were the currency of this house, and Clara's letter was proof of it. Returning to her room, she reread the letter, her thoughts crystallizing. The note was a lure, but its purpose, blackmail, warning, or deception, remained unclear. The torn lace and footprints suggested Clara had reached the arbour, but what had happened next? Miss Marple thought of the village grocer's wife, who had vanished after a mysterious meeting, only to be found safe, but shaken. Clara's fate, she feared, might be less benign. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple resolved to keep the diary hidden, sharing its contents only when the time was right. The manor was a web of motives: money, love, jealousy, and the letter was a thread she would follow. Her knitting needles resumed their quiet rhythm, a counterpoint to the storm brewing within her mind. The truth, she knew, was close, waiting to be teased out by her patient, watchful eyes. Chapter 6. The Solicitor's Secret. The afternoon light at Winthrop Manor had taken on a muted, sombre hue, as if the sun itself were reluctant to illuminate the growing unease within the grand house. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles idle for once, as she turned the pages of Clara Winthrop's diary in her mind. The hidden note, with its urgent summons to the arbour, had confirmed her suspicion that Clara's disappearance was no impulsive flight, but a calculated act, orchestrated by someone within the manor's walls. The torn lace, the footprint, and the cryptic words, "Your future depends on it," pointed to a secret that had driven Clara into the night. Miss Marple's task now was to uncover that secret, and she knew the key lay in the silences and glances of those around her. The household was restless, the initial shock of Clara's absence giving way to a brittle tension. Lady Beatrice moved through the rooms like a ghost, her gracious composure fraying as she issued distracted orders to the servants. Edward Langley, though outwardly calm, had a tautness about him, his eyes scanning every face as if seeking answers or guarding against questions. George Winthrop remained cloistered in the library, his drinking unabated, while Lydia Crane's sharp glances and nervous gestures betrayed a mind ill at ease. Mr. Harold Vance, the solicitor, was the most elusive, his nervous fidgeting and hurried exits drawing Miss Marple's attention like a moth to a flame. She decided to seek out Mr. Vance, sensing that his unease held a clue. Solicitors, in her experience, were often privy to secrets, wills, debts, family disputes that others preferred to keep hidden. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unravelled a case of fraud by noticing a clerk's hesitation over a ledger. Here, Mr. Vance's agitation suggested he knew more about Clara's situation than he had let on. Miss Marple found him in the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy oak furniture. Vance was hunched over a desk, papers spread before him, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he scribbled notes. The air smelled of old books and the faint tang of George's brandy, though the young man was absent, his decanter left on a side table. Miss Marple approached quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying the quiet authority of one accustomed to being heard. "Might I have a word? I hope I'm not disturbing you." Vance started, his pen scratching a jagged line across the page. "Miss Marple!" he exclaimed, adjusting his spectacles. No, not at all. Just reviewing some documents. The estate, you know. Always work to be done." His smile was strained, and his fingers twitched toward a stack of papers, as if to hide them. Miss Marple settled into a chair opposite him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It must be a great responsibility, managing the Winthrop affairs," she said, her tone conversational. "Clara's marriage, I imagine, brings all sorts of legal matters to the fore. Her inheritance, for instance. Such things can complicate a wedding." Vance's eyes flickered, and he pushed his spectacles up again, a nervous tick. "Oh yes, quite. The Winthrop estate is complex. Clara's inheritance is substantial, of course, due upon her marriage. But it's all in order, I assure you." His voice was too quick, his words tumbling over each other. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly interest. "Substantial, you say? That must attract attention, perhaps even envy. In my little village, I've seen how money can stir up trouble, even among the best families." Vance swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Envy, I suppose. That is, there are always those who might resent such wealth. But Clara is well loved, and Mr. Langley is a fine match." He hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Though, if I may be frank, Miss Marple, there are pressures. Certain parties might prefer the estate remain as it is." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her face remained serene. "Pressures, Mr. Vance? Do you mean within the family? Or perhaps someone else?" Vance glanced toward the door, as if fearing eavesdroppers. "I shouldn't say more," he murmured. "It's not my place. But Lady Beatrice has had to manage expectations. George, for instance, he's had difficulties. Debts, you understand." And others? Well, let's just say Clara's fortune is a topic of interest. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing his words. George's debts were no surprise, given his reckless air, but Vance's hesitation suggested deeper currents, perhaps a rival claimant, or a secret tied to the estate. "You're very discreet, Mr. Vance," she said, her smile disarming. "But I'm sure you have Clara's best interests at heart. If anything were amiss, you'd know, wouldn't you?" Vance's face paled, and he shuffled his papers. I do my best, Miss Marple, but with Clara gone, it's all so uncertain." He rose abruptly, muttering about urgent business, and hurried from the room, leaving a faint scent of ink and anxiety behind. Miss Marple remained seated, her thoughts racing. Vance's nervousness was not that of a guilty man, but of one caught in a web he could not escape. He knew something, perhaps about the estate, or about someone who coveted Clara's fortune. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a solicitor's reluctance to speak had hidden a forged will. Here, the stakes seemed higher, tied to Clara's disappearance and the mysterious note. Her reverie was interrupted by a soft creak from the hall. Peering through the library door, she glimpsed Lydia Crane passing by, her steps quick and furtive. Miss Marple rose, her curiosity piqued, and followed at a discreet distance, her sensible shoes silent on the polished floor. Lydia slipped into the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with ferns and blooming orchids, where George stood, his back to the door, staring out at the gardens. Miss Marple paused just outside, hidden by a heavy curtain, her ears attuned to their low voices. "You knew about the letter," George hissed, his tone sharp with accusation. "What did you tell her, Lydia? You've always been jealous of her." Lydia's reply was barely audible, but its edge was clear. "I told her nothing, George. You're the one who's been reckless. If she found out—" Her words cut off, as if she regretted saying too much, and Miss Marple strained to hear more. George's voice dropped to a growl. "Keep your mouth shut, or we'll both regret it." The sound of glass clinking followed, and Lydia's footsteps retreated, swift and angry. Miss Marple stepped back, her heart quickening. The exchange confirmed her suspicions. There was a secret, shared by George and Lydia, tied to Clara's actions. The letter, she thought, might have been their doing, or someone else's, exploiting their weaknesses. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking as she pieced together the puzzle. George's debts and Lydia's envy were motives, but the letter's handwriting did not match either's. She had seen George's scrawl on a hunting log and Lydia's neat script in a guest book. Mr. Vance's nervous hints pointed to the estate, perhaps a clause in Clara's inheritance that threatened someone's plans. Edward, too, remained a question mark. His devotion to Clara seemed real, but his guarded air suggested he too held secrets. At tea, the household gathered again, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken fears. Beatrice, her hands trembling, poured tea with mechanical precision, while Edward spoke of organising a wider search, his voice steady, but his eyes haunted. Lydia sat apart, her gaze fixed on the floor, and George was absent, likely still in the library. Mr. Vance appeared briefly, only to excuse himself, citing urgent correspondence. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, addressed Edward with her usual mildness. "Mr. Langley, you must know Clara's habits well. Did she ever mention walking in the gardens at night? Perhaps she felt restless." Edward's jaw tightened, but he answered, smoothly, "Not at night, Miss Marple. She loved the gardens, but she was cautious. If she went out, it was for a reason." His words were measured, but Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he feared what that reason might be. Turning to Lydia, she tried another tack. "Miss Crane, you and Clara were so close. Did she ever share any worries about the wedding? Young brides often have doubts, you know." Lydia's cup rattled in its saucer. "She was nervous, as I said, but nothing specific. She trusted Edward completely." Her voice was clipped, and Miss Marple caught the glance she shot at Edward, sharp with something unspoken. Resentment, perhaps, or betrayal. As the tea was cleared, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the note. Its plain paper suggested someone within the manor, but its angular script was unfamiliar. She considered the servants, but Elsie's honesty seemed genuine, and the other staff were too busy with wedding preparations to plot such a scheme. The answer, she felt, lay with the guests, each with their own motives, each hiding something. By evening, the police had found no trace of Clara, and the manor settled into an uneasy quiet. Miss Marple, in her room, reread the note, her mind tracing its implications. The Arbour meeting had been a trap, she was certain, but whether Clara had been taken or had fled remained unclear. She thought of the village postmaster's wife, whose disappearance had been solved by a single overheard whisper. Here, the whispers were many, but the truth was close. She could feel it. As she prepared for bed, her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, a steady counterpoint to the questions swirling in her mind. The solicitor's secret, George's anger, Lydia's envy, Edward's guardedness, all were threads in a tapestry she was determined to unravel. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would press further, for Clara's fate depended on it. Chapter 7. The Truth Unravelled. The morning after Clara Winthrop's disappearance dawned grey and heavy, the skies over Winthrop Manor laden with clouds that mirrored the gloom within. Miss Jane Marple rose early, her mind sharp despite the restless night, her thoughts weaving together the threads of the mystery, the torn lace in the garden, the solitary footprint, the cryptic note in Clara's diary, and the fraught exchanges among the manor's inhabitants. The letter's urgent summons to the arbour, "Your future depends on it," had lured Clara into the night, and Miss Marple was certain the truth lay not in the distant woods where the police searched, but here, among the secrets of the household. The manor was subdued, its grand halls echoing with the quiet tread of servants and the low murmurs of anxious guests. Lady Beatrice, her face etched with worry, moved through the morning's routine with a mechanical grace, while Edward Langley maintained a stoic front, organising search parties with a determination that bordered on desperation. George Winthrop, bleary-eyed and sullen, kept to the fringes, his brandy glass rarely absent. Lydia Crane's sharp features were drawn, her eyes darting nervously, and Mr. Harold Vance, the solicitor, flitted about with papers in hand, his nervous energy undimmed. Miss Marple, ever the unobtrusive observer, watched them all from her corner of the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she planned her next move. The diary and its hidden note, still safely tucked in her handbag, had given her a framework, but the motives remained elusive. George's debts, Lydia's envy, Edward's guarded past, and Vance's hints about the estate suggested a web of greed and resentment, but the letter's angular script pointed to a single hand, one she had yet to identify. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a village girl's disappearance had been traced to a jealous rival's scheme. Here, the stakes were higher, tied to Clara's substantial inheritance, but the human impulses, fear, envy, desperation, were the same. Determined to force the truth into the open, Miss Marple requested a gathering in the drawing-room after breakfast. Beatrice, eager for any progress, agreed, and by mid-morning the key players were assembled. Beatrice, pale but composed. Edward, his jaw tight. George, slouched and defiant. Lydia, her hands clasped tightly. And Mr. Vance, hovering nervously at the edge. The constable, Perkins, was present, his notebook at the ready, but Miss Marple knew the official inquiry would benefit from her subtle prodding. She stood, her slight figure commanding attention through sheer presence, her voice gentle but firm. "I have been thinking," she began, her eyes moving over the group. About poor Clara's disappearance. It is clear she did not leave of her own accord, not willingly. The lace torn from her veil, found in the garden, and the footprint by the arbour suggest she went to meet someone, drawn by a note that promised answers. She paused, noting the flicker of unease in Lydia's eyes and the sudden stillness of George's posture. Beatrice gasped softly. "A note? Jane, what do you mean?" Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "A letter, found in Clara's diary, urging her to meet someone at midnight by the arbour. It was unsigned, but its tone was urgent, almost threatening. Clara wrote that she felt compelled to go, despite her fear. I believe she discovered a secret, something that threatened someone in this house." Edward's face darkened, his voice sharp. "A secret? That's absurd, Miss Marple. Clara was happy. She had no reason to fear anyone." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze steady. "And yet, Mr. Langley, she went to the arbour in her nightgown, leaving her wedding dress behind. That suggests haste, perhaps panic. The letter spoke of her future, and I wonder, did it concern her inheritance? Or perhaps something about you?" Edward's hands clenched, but he said nothing, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and fear. Miss Marple turned to Lydia. "Miss Crane, you were Clara's closest friend. Did she ever confide in you about a worry, something that might have prompted such a meeting?" Lydia's lips parted, then closed, her face paling. She was nervous about the wedding, as I've said, but nothing about a letter. I don't know what you're implying." Her voice was brittle, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands twisted in her lap, a mirror of Clara's anxious habit. George snorted, his voice thick with disdain. "This is nonsense. Clara probably got cold feet and ran off. You're making a mystery where there's none." But his eyes avoided Miss Marple's, and his hand trembled as he reached for his glass. Mr. Vance shifted uncomfortably, his spectacles glinting. If there was a letter, it could be a prank. Young people do foolish things before weddings. His words lacked conviction, and Miss Marple caught the glance he shot at Beatrice, as if seeking her guidance. Beatrice, her composure faltering, spoke softly. "Jane, you think someone here harmed Clara? But why? She was loved by everyone." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her voice held a quiet steel. "Not everyone, Lady Beatrice. Money, as I've seen in my little village, can turn love to resentment. Clara's inheritance due upon her marriage was substantial, was it not? That might tempt someone to act, to delay or prevent the wedding." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. Miss Marple pressed on, her tone gentle but relentless. "Mr. Vance, you hinted yesterday at pressures within the family. Perhaps you could enlighten us." Vance's face flushed, his fingers fumbling with his papers. I meant only that George has debts, as everyone knows. But I never suggested. That is, I have no proof of anything untoward." George slammed his glass down, his voice rising. "You dare accuse me? I'm her cousin. I'd never harm Clara." His outrage was fierce, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his eyes darted to Lydia. She turned to Lydia, her voice soft as ever. "Miss Crane, last night I overheard you and Mr. Winthrop in the conservatory. You spoke of a letter, and he seemed angry. Did you know of Clara's meeting at the arbour?" Lydia's eyes widened, her breath catching. "You were spying," she snapped, then caught herself. "I mean, I didn't know about any letter. George and I were talking about something else. Family matters." Her words were unconvincing, and Miss Marple saw Edward's gaze sharpen, as if he sensed a betrayal. Beatrice, trembling, rose to her feet. "Jane, please, tell us what you know. If Clara is in danger, we must act." Miss Marple nodded, her mind clear. "I believe Clara was lured to the arbour by someone who feared her marriage, perhaps because of the inheritance, or a secret it would expose. The letter was written by someone in this house, someone who knew her habits and could slip a note under her door. the torn lace and footprint, suggest she reached the arbour but was interrupted, perhaps taken or persuaded to hide. She paused, her eyes resting on Beatrice. "Lady Beatrice, you invited me here. An old friend with a knack for noticing things. Did you suspect trouble? Perhaps a threat to Clara's happiness?" Beatrice's hands flew to her face, her voice breaking. I feared something, Jane. There were whispers. George's debts, Lydia's bitterness. I overheard them arguing, plotting to delay the wedding. I thought it was just talk, but when Clara vanished..." She broke off, tears spilling over. Lydia gasped, her face crumpling. "It wasn't meant to harm her," she cried, the words bursting forth. "I wrote the note. I admit it. I wanted to scare Clara, to make her postpone the wedding. She was rushing into it, blind to Edward's past. I thought if she doubted him, she'd wait. But I didn't take her. I swear it." George lurched to his feet, his face red. "You idiot, Lydia. You told her to meet you at the arbour. I found her there, arguing with her. She was hysterical, saying she'd tell Edward everything. I panicked. I locked her in the gardener's shed to keep her quiet until I could talk sense into her. I didn't mean to hurt her." The room erupted in gasps, and Edward lunged toward George, only to be restrained by the constable. "You locked her up?" he roared. "Where is she now?" Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm but commanding. "Mr. Winthrop, take us to the shed at once. Clara may still be there." Guided by George, who was now shaking with shame, the group hurried to the old gardener's shed, hidden behind a copse of yews. The door was padlocked, but a key hung on a nail nearby. The constable opened it, revealing Clara, pale and dishevelled, curled on a pile of sacks. She blinked against the light, her eyes wide with fear, but she was unharmed. Edward rushed to her, his relief palpable, while Beatrice sobbed openly. Clara, trembling, explained that George had locked her in after a heated argument, threatening to expose a secret she had uncovered, a secret about Edward's business dealings, hinted at in the earlier note she had burned. Lydia, overcome with guilt, admitted her jealousy had driven her to write the second note, hoping to sow doubt, but she had not anticipated George's actions. Miss Marple watched quietly, her work done. The truth, as always, had been in the small things, the torn lace, the footprint, the note's rough paper. She thought of a St. Mary Mead scandal, where a hidden truth had unravelled a family. Here, the motives were greed and envy, but the outcome, mercifully, was not tragedy. As the police took statements and George faced consequences, Miss Marple slipped away, her knitting bag in hand. The manor's secrets had been laid bare, and Clara was safe. Her task, she knew, was complete, but the human heart, with its endless complexities, would always offer new puzzles. Chapter 8. The Bride's Return. The clouds over Winthrop Manor parted as the afternoon sun cast a tentative glow across the gardens, as if nature itself were relieved by the resolution of the morning's turmoil. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the drawing-room, her black lace shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The discovery of Clara Winthrop in the gardener's shed, shaken but unharmed, had lifted the pall of dread from the household, but the air still hummed with the aftershocks of truth revealed. George Winthrop, his face a mask of shame, had been taken into custody by Constable Perkins, while Lydia Crane, her confession of writing the deceptive note wrung from her in a flood of guilt, faced questioning. Miss Marple, her role in unravelling the mystery complete, observed the scene with her usual quiet satisfaction, her mind already turning to the journey home. Clara, wrapped in a blanket and sipping tea by the fire, was the centre of attention. Edward Langley knelt beside her, his hand clasping hers, his face etched with relief and remorse. "I should have told you everything," he murmured, his voice low. "If I had, none of this would have happened." Clara's eyes, still wide with the memory of her ordeal, softened as she touched his cheek, whispering assurances that Miss Marple did not strain to hear. The bond between them, tested by secrets, seemed to hold. Lady Beatrice, her composure restored but her eyes red from tears, approached Miss Marple with a gratitude that bordered on reverence. "Jane, how can I ever thank you?" she said, her voice trembling. "You saw what we could not, what I should have seen. I invited you on a whim, hoping your presence might steady us, but you've saved Clara." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling with the modesty that masked her sharpness. "Oh, Beatrice dear, I only noticed what was there to see. People are much the same everywhere, you know, whether in a grand manner or my little St. Mary Mead. They leave clues in their words, their glances, their silences." She paused, her tone softening. "You suspected trouble, didn't you? That's why you sent for me." Beatrice nodded, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "I heard George and Lydia whispering, plotting to unsettle Clara. I thought it was just spite, a childish attempt to delay the wedding. I never imagined George would go so far as to lock her away. And Lydia, her jealousy blindsided me." Miss Marple patted her arm. "Jealousy and greed are old stories, Beatrice. In my village, I've seen them drive good people to foolish acts. George's debts made him desperate, and Lydia's envy of Clara's happiness clouded her judgment. But Clara is safe now, and that's what matters." The drawing room buzzed with subdued activity as the household adjusted to the resolution. Clara, her strength returning, recounted her ordeal to the constable, her voice steady but quiet. The first note, burned and unrecoverable, had hinted at Edward's past, a vague suggestion of financial troubles in his business dealings, enough to plant doubt. The second note, penned by Lydia, had lured her to the arbour, where George, drunk and panicked by her determination to confront Edward, had locked her in the shed to buy time. "I was so frightened," Clara admitted, her eyes meeting Edward's. "But I knew you'd find me." Edward's face tightened, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of guilt in his expression. Whatever secret he held, perhaps a minor indiscretion, perhaps something more, had not been enough to break Clara's trust, but it had fueled Lydia's scheme and George's desperation. Miss Marple, ever discreet, chose not to press. Some truths, she knew, were better left to the couple to resolve. Lydia, standing apart, her face pale and drawn, approached Clara hesitantly. "I never meant for this, Clara," she said, her voice breaking. "I was jealous. Your happiness, your future with Edward. It felt like everything I'd lost. I thought if you doubted him, you'd wait, and I could feel less alone. But I never wanted you hurt." Clara, her kindness undimmed, took Lydia's hand, offering forgiveness that Miss Marple suspected would take time to fully heal. As the police prepared to leave, taking George and Lydia for further questioning, Miss Marple gathered her things, her thoughts turning to St. Mary Mead. The manor, with its grand facade and hidden tensions, was not so different from her village, where secrets lurked behind lace curtains and polite smiles. She recalled a case of a missing heiress, solved by a single misplaced hairpin, and smiled to herself. The clues here, the torn lace, the footprint, the note, had been equally small, but no less telling. Beatrice insisted on arranging a car to take Miss Marple to the station, and as they stood in the hall, she pressed a small parcel into her hands. "A token of gratitude," she said, "a silk scarf embroidered with roses." "You must visit again, Jane," Beatrice said, her eyes warm. "Under happier circumstances." "I should like that," Miss Marple replied, though she knew mysteries had a way of finding her, whether in Danbury or St. Mary Mead. She climbed into the car, her knitting bag at her side, and as the manor receded into the distance, she gazed out at the autumn fields, their colours muted in the fading light. On the train, she opened her knitting, the familiar click of the needles, a soothing rhythm. Her mind replayed the events, George's desperation, driven by debts that threatened his place in the family, Lydia's envy, a poison that had festered into deceit, and Edward's secret, a shadow that had nearly cost Clara her freedom. The note, with its rough paper and angular script, had been the catalyst, but the true unravelling had come from human frailty, as it always did. She thought of Clara, safe now, and hoped the young woman would find happiness with Edward, whatever truths they faced together. As the train neared St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's eyes brightened at the sight of familiar rooftops. Home, with its quiet lanes and nosy neighbours, awaited, and with it, no doubt, new puzzles to solve. For now, she was content, her work at Winthrop Manor done, her faith in the predictability of human nature reaffirmed. The train slowed, and Miss Marple gathered her shawl and bag, ready to step back into the gentle chaos of village life. The bride had returned, the mystery solved, but the world she knew would always have more secrets to whisper, and she would be there, watching, listening, and knitting her way to the truth.